Hello and welcome to this month's first of two Level 2 eBay listings where we list 20 items that we think are interesting, fun, provocative, have good stories, and we put them on eBay auctions while you watch, provided you're a Level 2 or Level 3 member to my channel. I really appreciate the support that the Level 2 and 3 members give, and I'm very happy to give you early access to this video. And then we roll it out for everyone else to see too, so everyone gets a chance to see how these items do in the marketplace, make a bid if you like, if they're still available, follow along, see how they do. It's a great way to get a snapshot of the market, and I've been doing this for, a couple of years now. Last month we sold every item that we put out, and this month, well, it's going to be different in that we're not doing any buy it nows because of my scheduling. Sometimes we do buy it nows because it's a great way to sell things when we kind of have an idea of what they maybe should go for, and then people who just love them can step right up and get them. However, when I'm traveling, like I am this coming week, I have to be able to give it time to go through the entire auction so that I can actually get it shipped to you when I come back. So, no buy it nows this month, but we have lots of fun stuff, and let's get started because I just really have fun putting these things aside, and there's some interesting stories. And this one does have an interesting story, but it's actually a more recent vintage item than you might expect because this is a schizo color t-shirt. And schizo color is a lot like hypercolor. It's pretty much the same thing. If you were a kid in the 90s, you probably liked, wanted, or had a bunch of these shirts. The thing that was fun about them and novel at the time is that the color changes with heat. Now this one is called schizo color rather than hypercolor because this one was by a company in Seattle called Fast Clothing, and I actually got it because I worked for them briefly as a manager of a temporary store that they had when I was between jobs in the antique industry. See how it turned yellow there just from the heat? That was the thing that was so cool about these. And you can tell this is from about 1990. It actually is made in USA. It has the Fast Clothing label. We think of fast clothing as being a term now, but back in 1990, it actually was a brand based in Seattle. They are long since out of business. But if you look at this guy, he is the very, very typical 1990 vintage poster child with the big, huge shoes and the untied laces and the oversized board shorts and a little bit of jewelry and little sunglasses and a big floppy shirt. That is definitely what I remember a lot of people looking like back at this time. This one has a little bit of soiling, which is funny because I never really wore it, but this is actually something I've been carrying around for years. And now, well, they're vintage because I've been around some years. So I decided it was time to put this out on the market. It is starting at $9.99. I'm noticing that these hypercolor pieces are doing pretty well because a lot of them got just washed to death or stained or thrown out when people grew up. So now there's a generation that's getting into 90s vintage fashion, and that is our customer for that, I suspect, or maybe somebody who had it back in the day. I'll be curious to see where that goes. Our next piece here is from the 1933 Chicago World's Fair, and I always liked the 1933 World's Fair because it was very Art Deco, but this piece is not really too deco in styling because this is a tray, a glass reverse painted silhouette tray, and this one has Fort Dearborn, 1933. Fort Dearborn was partially reconstructed for the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. It was the original fort in Chicago built in 1803, 30 years before the town was officially founded. But there were already people living in Chicago. In fact, the first person living in the area was a French-speaking person of African descent, and he is considered the town founder. And that was Jean-Baptiste Pointe du Sable. And I hope I didn't massacre that too badly. But he lived pretty close to where this fort was built. This fort was built because of Native American uprisings and sympathies between the Native Americans and the British during the War of 1812, during which this was sacked and burned, and then they rebuilt it. It lasted until the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 took out the remaining pieces of it. At that point, it was not there until they rebuilt part of it for the World's Fair. So it's an interesting piece because of its history. The Chicago World's Fair was a huge runaway success. It was mainly about modernism and dreaming of a future after the Depression, even though it took place in the depths of the Depression. And at 50 cents a head, they still got millions and millions and millions of visitors during very hard economic times. It was all about futurism. They had everything from Sally Rand and the Fan Dancers and the Andrews Sisters, who were brand new, sang, but they also had car manufacturers with their visions of the future, architectural renderings of buildings they thought would be in the future, which all had a very cool streamlined Art Deco design. They had an air tram. They even had cigar smoking robots. So they were thinking ahead back then. These trays were popular for people to use as bed trays or little serving trays. This is about the time people start sitting in the living room and listening to radio with a snack. So suddenly, for the first time, you didn't have everybody at the dinner table, and people needed things like this. You don't find them very often. You don't find them in such great condition practically ever. The frame is in good shape. The color is good. Everything about it is in great condition. And we are starting it at just $29.99. I suspect it might be worth as much as twice that to a World's Fair collector, and we're going to find out. Yeah, I have some large items this time. I am shipping from Kentucky, so the shipping costs won't be as bad, so I decided to put some big things out I've been holding off on because I was in Florida this winter. This is the Jeanette Jr. Children's Glass Set, and it is the dinner set in a very, very popular pattern, one of the most popular Depression glass patterns ever, actually. We'll take off that cute lid and show you, because this is the cherry blossom pattern. And there is the full set. My mother had this set when she was very little, and then her parents made her give it up for a war drive during the Second World War to help orphan children. And she always wanted to get it back, and she finally did. At the time she got it, these were selling for really big prices. At one time, this would have been a $300 set. Now they probably sell for about a third or half of that. But this one's very complete and has everything and is in great condition. Cherry Blossom is a very cute pattern. There you go. And it has it on the bottom as well. You will see reproductions of the children's dishes, but primarily it's the butter dish, which was not originally made as part of the set, so that's an easy one to tell apart. Cherry Blossom, if you notice, has an all-over design. This was done by Jeanette Glass. One of the reasons that they had all-over designs in Depression glass was it was made in molds, and sometimes it would get little bubbles or straw marks or imperfections, and having a pattern that covered the whole thing covered up the imperfections, and that way they were able to make it very cheaply. A lot of people identify Depression glass as something, oh, you got it in a box of oats or you got it at the movie, because they were so desperate to get people to have it that they gave it away. Well, that's a little bit untrue. Actually, the Depression glass industry was one of the few industries that did well in the Depression because it was colorful and fun and bright and something that was new and modern and a relief and not as heavy as the old style of glass. The reason they did the giveaways was to get a piece in your hand so that then you would want to go and buy more of the set. That was, you see a lot of premiums given out in the Depression era because it was to stimulate trade. This set is very complete. There is no damage, and we are starting it, believe it or not, at only $9.99, even though it is worth considerably more than that. So we're going to, and no reserve, no buy it now. We're just going to let the market run it up, and we will see what the total is. But it is very cute. It even has in pencil by the little girl in the middle's feet, it has the name of its original owner, who I believe was Bella. So Bella's set is going to go to somebody new. Now this next piece is something I have to say I've always really loved. And if this was my colors for my house, it wouldn't be here being sold. But it is a very pretty color that does not match my thing, so I have to put it up for sale. It is the Swordfish vase. This vase or planter is by Royal Hager, and look at this great blue and green mottled glaze. Royal Hickman was the designer for Royal Hager of Dundee, Illinois for a long time. Let's get this right where you can see the name. And yes, his first name was Royal. So when he did the designs for Hager, he did Royal for Royal Hickman. And it made it sound very lofty, like maybe it was good quality like English stuff. So Hager did not mind putting the royal name on everything. He was their in-house designer in the 1930s. The pieces he did then have the R in them. So this was originally a 1930s piece, but he then came back. He had his own pottery in Florida for a while, the Royal Hickman pottery. He found out that Florida is a tough place to make pottery in the summer because the humidity gets trapped in everything and makes the glazes hard to do. So he eventually became a freelancer, but he mainly worked for Hager again in the 1950s and 60s. So this piece, I believe, is actually a 1950s glaze treatment on his original 1930s design. It's a really, really fun piece, and it's pretty substantial. They're about 12.5 inches by 10.5 inches, so it's got a great look. If you like Art Deco, if you like fish, if you like sea life, if you just think the glaze is cool, there's a whole lot of reasons to like this piece. I'm starting it at only $39. I think it's easily worth about twice that, and we'll see what everyone else thinks when it gets out there on auctions. And one thing I should say is the reason I do auctions, I know some people say, well, you just do better if you put things in a fixed price store. I've also heard a bunch of people saying lately, oh, I'm not selling very well on eBay. Well, you know, sometimes if you buy something right, it is good to sometimes stimulate interest. I will get people who will look at the rest of the things in my store because they came to look at my auctions. So, you know, there's more than one strategy here. I know auctions are something most people are not doing these days on eBay, but I'm finding that for the most part, my sales are pretty good and things are usually going for at least what they should, and sometimes they really pop and go for more. So I'm willing to give it a shot. This is a signed and not a fan auto pen sign, but a real actual signature from William Holden, the actor. And William Holden started out as William Beadle. They didn't think that sounded like a very great leading man name, so they changed it to William Holden because someone at Paramount had a friend named Holden and thought, well, Bill Holden, that sounds pretty good. And it stuck. There is the signature. You can see it is a real signature. Oops, let's see if we can get it to stay in focus there. So it is not an auto pen. It's not something signed by the secretary. This is his actual signature, and that does make a difference in value and desirability on these old fan pieces. William Holden had a 40-year career, and his breakthrough, of course, was Sunset Boulevard. He'd been in a bunch of movies before that and done perfectly fine and was climbing up the ladder in the studio system at Paramount. But he got really tired of playing just sort of your typical leading man supporting actor role. And Sunset Boulevard gave him the chance to play a real cad. And yes, he is the one who ends up face down in the pool. So he came to a bad end right at the beginning of that movie as they're doing the flashback. Because he did so well in that movie, they started putting him in a lot of movies, and he ended up winning an Oscar in 1953 for Stalag 17. And by the time he did Bridge Over the River Kwai, they cut him in for 10%, and he became a millionaire overnight because it was a very successful movie. So he was one of the most popular actors in Hollywood at the time. He was still acting in the 1970s. He was in Network and The Towering Inferno. He died, unfortunately, of a fall because he had become an alcoholic, and he fell at his home and did not survive. And he was involved with Stephanie Powers, the actress from Heart to Heart at the time. She helped establish a wildlife foundation in his honor because that was a real passion of his. So he's got an interesting history. This piece, I think, from the chartreuse background is probably a 1950s fan piece, right about the time he was at the very peak of his popularity. And the thing I like the most about him is his Oscar acceptance speech in 1953 consisted of saying, "Thank you," and sitting down. Boy, could we use a few actors who had that sort of a short acceptance speech these days, right? So anyhow, an interesting man. We're starting this at $9.99. It is in a more contemporary frame, and it will be sent in the contemporary frame to keep it well. This next piece I picked up in Chattanooga at a place called Dirty Jane's. I did a video recently. It's a wonderful antique mall with really cool stuff, more of a decorator focus, but absolutely focused on vintage and antique. I found some neat stuff to buy there. The people were very friendly, and one thing I saw in their window from outside that I hadn't seen in years were a couple of these stained glass pieces with lithograph on the glass. And the lithograph on this glass, let's get it where you can see it a little better, is Victoria Tower. You'll recognize that as being part of the Parliament building in London. This was built in 1860. It took 17 years to build. It was a cast iron frame. When it opened in 1860 at 316 feet, it was the tallest square tower in the world. And it was built to be fireproof because in 1834, the English had lost a lot of parliamentary records and books in a fire, and they did not want that to happen again, so this became the repository. It is also the place that the, well, now king will be entering Parliament. The opening of Parliament, that's where the monarch walks into the Parliament building, is through Victoria Tower. It was called King's Tower at first, and then at Victoria's Jubilee in 1897, they renamed it after her. It's a wonderful Art Nouveau piece of stained glass, and it should date from about the time of her Jubilee, around the late 1890s. I just love the colors. It's been put in a newer frame. A lot of stained glass that comes over from England is put in these raw wood frames in order that it get here safely. It will be shipped this way as well for the same reason. I just think it's a really pretty and really interesting piece. And frankly, I would leave it in the frame and paint it a color that you like and hang it. But I think it's quite fascinating, the fact that it has this glass lithography. That was a pretty new concept in the 1890s when this was made. It's 14 inches by 17 and a half, and it is going to start at $79. I am expecting that it will probably sell for about double that if the right people see it, because now we have the ability, with eBay's new international shipping program, we are actually more able to ship things to Canada and England and other places in the English Commonwealth. And so I think there will probably be interest there if there's not someone in the States who wants it. This next piece, with all the interest in Native American jewelry, is a real find, and I'm really glad to be able to share this one with you. This is a sterling necklace. This is Navajo made. It definitely has a traditional geometric pattern on it. And this one is signed Laner, L-A-N-E-R. Troy Laner was a Navajo silversmith. And you can see the signature on the back there. Troy Laner was born in 1969 in Shiprock, New Mexico. And he did not live to a ripe old age. He only lived to be 43, so his designs, as great as they were, are pretty limited in nature, especially because they were all handmade. These were done using a technique originally done by the Hopi in their jewelry starting in the 1930s and 40s that then caught on with Navajo makers. And what it is silver overlay. So you actually, even though you can't tell looking at the side, you actually have two layers of silver here. The top layer is open, and then by punching and working through, they actually work the design into the second layer, and there's a certain amount of niello work, giving it that blackness there so that the design pops out. Troy Laner was like a lot of the earlier Navajo artists in that he did not have his own gallery. He actually made the pieces and then took them to Gallup and traded them and got money for the things he needed to live. And so it's much more in the line of the way that the old pawn jewelry was dealt with and traded, as opposed to the way that most Native American jewelry is done now, where it's done by a designer in a gallery and sold and controlled by the designer. There are not a ton of Troy Laner pieces around, but the work is very good, and because of that, it sells for good money. This piece I have seen sell in the $350 range, in the $400 range, and in the $500 range, depending on who is out there. So we are going to start this at $9.99, but we do have a reserve. The reserve is less than all of those numbers that I told you, so I think it has a good chance to sell. It's a really beautiful piece, and it is really nice to be able to bring you something that is actually fairly scarce. There are a lot of collectors for his pieces and not a ton of supply. This next piece is interesting to me because I really enjoy music of this era. I really like 1960s garage bands and psychedelia. Now this one was actually more of a jazz rock band, which is also a genre I like, and they were called Circus Maximus, but you can tell looking at the photo with the overlays and that sort of trippy kind of photography where you see one person sort of through another. This is absolutely 1967. The Summer of Love and lots of psychedelic bands. Now, this was an East Coast band rather than a West Coast band called Circus Maximus, and their most famous member was Jerry Jeff Walker, who left the band after this, and the next year he was more of a country jazz rocker, and he wrote Mr. Bojangles, which was a very famous hit and his biggest hit in his career. This is in excellent shape. It's got the original cellophane. It doesn't look like it was played very many times. I have pictures of it online. I'm not going to take it out of its sleeve because I don't want to get fingerprints on it. Their most famous song was a song called The Wind, or just Wind, actually. It was 8 minutes long, which was very long for that time, but this was right about the time FM comes in, and so long songs started to be the thing that people wanted to listen to on FM radio. And so Circus Maximus, that was their big hit. It was mainly a regional hit in the Northeast. They were out of New York, but it was something that got airplay all over the country. There is a lot of interest in relatively obscure psychedelic era bands now, and especially when you can find an album that's in really nice condition like this. So we're starting it at $9.99. It is probably worth about 3 times that. At least that's what they typically are selling for. So we'll see what this one hammers at when we put it on. I have always been a fan of this next line. And this one is a little bit unusual because it's a solid color of milk glass, but this is Phoenix's version of line 700. Line 700 is part of the line that Consolidated Glass started in the 1920s called Martelet, and it was based on Lalique glass. They were very influenced by what Lalique was doing at the time. Now, in the 1920s, when Consolidated made this, this would have been a clear glass, satin glass with a bit of a color wash. Then in the 1930s, Phoenix Glass took over a lot of Consolidated's molds. Consolidated went out of business, then tried to come back into business. There was a big tussle over who had the rights to the molds, but Phoenix ultimately won, and they made glass in solid colors, including this milk glass piece. And this was made well into the 1950s, which is when I believe this piece was made, because it does not have a real fiery opal cast. It has more of a grayish cast, and that's indicative of milk glass from that era. This line is so ahead of its time and was so well designed that it resurfaced again in the hands of Pilgrim Glass, and they made some pieces in their colors in the early 1990s. And I'm not sure who has the molds now, but I bet they are sitting in some other glass company's warehouse. So we may see this line come about again. It's just got this interesting combination of naturalism with this Art Deco / Art Nouveau arching. And that is, again, because it was derivative of things that Lalique was doing, but this is a molded form as opposed to the hand-blown pieces that Lalique did. So I think it's a neat piece. I'm starting it at only $39. They never were marked. It does have the little circle on the bottom from the mold. I believe the value of this is probably about double that. And we don't see it in milk glass very often. And now with the gray interiors, a lot of people are painting walls gray, and there's a lot of sort of cool tones. The white is a nice thing in contrast. So I think we may have a customer for that we would not have had a few years ago. A few years ago, they would have wanted that to be one of the more washed pieces with just a faint color tint. So times change and tastes change, but a good line stays in a line for a long time, and that line has been around since the 1920s. If you think that's impressive, our next piece is actually something that's been around since 1866, one of the first soft drinks ever, and that is Vernors Ginger Ale. And this little tumbler may not seem like much, but it's very thin, it's screen painted, it has the apostrophe, which they lost at some point in the 1950s. This dates back to the Depression, when again, companies are giving out glass as premiums, and so this was at some sort of a drugstore counter, most likely in the Detroit area. Vernors started in Detroit. In fact, Mr. Vernor himself worked originally for the Higbee and Stearns, and yes, it's the correct spelling, like my last name, the drugstore in Detroit. And in the 1860s, he was a pharmacist. He branched out on his own, and one of his first products was ginger ale, where he took ginger and vanilla and added it to carbonation. And the idea was it will help settle your stomach. So it was originally a remedy. Of course, the formula has changed over the years with the advent of things like high fructose corn syrup and all that. The other thing that's changed is Vernors has gone from a regional brand that stayed a regional brand. I remember I had a friend from Detroit who moved to Seattle in the 1980s, and when he would go back to Detroit, he would bring back a 6-pack of Vernors on the plane and carry it on and give us all one and make a Boston cooler where you put the ice cream in it. And told us this is a really big deal because you can only get this in Detroit. Well, a few years later, it finally went national, and it's now a pretty well-recognized and well-regarded national brand, and you can get it in almost any store. But back when these glasses were made, this was a small regional brand, and because of that, these tumblers are actually fairly hard to find. You see thicker ones from a later time, but this one is thin like most of the pre-Prohibition whiskey glasses. And so we know that this has some age. It should date to about 1935. Again, we're going to start this at $9.99. I haven't seen one just like this sell, so I'm curious to see how it will go and whether it will go to Detroit or to some other soda fountain collector elsewhere in the country. Our next piece is really lovely, and I'm glad to show it because not only is it a beautiful piece and a very fine piece of porcelain, but we are starting to see interest in fine pieces of porcelain again on a level that we haven't for a number of years. And this particular one is very nice. It is a Dresden piece. It is Rococo Revival in style, which was very popular in the 1890s. And with Rococo, you notice the rim. None of it is an exact repeat. It's all a little bit asymmetrical. It is not trying to be a mirror image of itself. I'm going to show you the marks on the bottom because it has a couple of them. It has the Dresden H mark. That would be the middle 1890s when this was made. It also has this little gold cartouche here with the flower. That indicates that the blank, the piece of porcelain, was made by Royal Vienna. There is a misunderstanding that Dresden is all made on Meissen blanks, and there's an even bigger misunderstanding that Dresden actually made the porcelain. Dresden is a town near Meissen where the Meissen porcelain factories would send things to be painted, primarily factory seconds. And you will see that this indeed actually is a little bit of a factory second. It has one little glaze miss right there where I'm pointing my finger. See where it's a little bit dark? That's not a chip. That's actually where the glaze just sort of popped a little bit and left a little bit of a mark. That's why this piece was not decorated at Meissen, but was sent to Dresden to one of the decorating houses there. At one time, there were over 200 different houses in Dresden that painted these pieces. But they also got pieces from the Royal Vienna porcelain in Austria, and that's this mark. So this tells us this is one of those pieces. So a lot of interesting little facts, and it's actually painted in a way very similar to how Royal Vienna would do, where there's a floral spray, but again, each floral spray is different. They are not exactly alike. And when you see on the inside, the flowers are not all exactly alike either. And that was emblematic of Royal Vienna work, and the Dresden painters decided to honor that work with this piece that they did on a Royal Vienna blank. So it's just got an interesting history as well as being very beautiful. And we're starting to see people really appreciate fancy porcelain again. It's been a while. I think people have been so focused on mid-century and everything having very clean lines that now you have a whole generation that has seen nothing but clean lines and straight lines and boxy furniture, and some of them are getting a little bored of it and they're looking for something else, and this is that something else. We're seeing these things starting to sell for prices that they've been sitting at not selling for the last 30 years. This one I suspect is worth about $175. We're going to start at just under $100, and we'll let the market tell us where it is now. But I think it's a very, very pretty piece, and it's so nice to have something that is a true antique of real quality to show that has a good history and a nice story behind it. Now this piece is really heavy. And there's a good reason for it, because it is made of bronze and marble, and boy, it weighs a ton. So I'm going to hold it up as long as I can, but it's a beautiful piece. This is a French 1930s Art Deco flying goose statue on a mixed marble plinth. So these are various pieces of marble in various colors. And some of the colors were hard to get even back then. The reds here with all of the texturing are a little scarcer. Marble was something that was used extensively in the 1930s. You look at the Chrysler Building in New York or Seattle Tower in Seattle, where they used a lot of marble in the interiors. And the reason that marble was available is because it was the Depression. And in the Depression, all of a sudden, you could afford to use materials that had been very expensive before, and you could make very heavy objects because shipping was very, very inexpensive all of a sudden. These pieces were made in France. You often see these as clock bases. This particular one does not have a clock associated with it. I just think it's really cool. And the goose was the flying goose in particular was popular because it implied being able to journey and having freedom because of the way geese navigate, and the fact that the lead goose flies until it's tired and then another goose takes its place, and it's very orderly. And so this was supposed to symbolize freedom and mobility at a time when a lot of people who didn't have money were stuck at home. But if you had money, you could afford pieces like this. A lot of these came to the United States in the 1970s and 80s when Art Deco became very popular to collect. It is all pieced together. This thing weighs over 12 pounds, so it will probably be sent UPS with a whole lot of packing, but it's in good shape. There's no dents, nothing broken or chipped. I think it's just beautiful. I would own something like this. In fact, I have owned things like this back when I was an Art Deco collector. I had a wonderful green marble clock that was fairly similar to that. So I think it's a real stunner, and I suspect that it's worth about $2.25, but we're going to start at just under $100 and let the market have fun with that. Now we're going to a different part of the world and a much more informal looking piece that is very sweet and has a good story as well. This is Oaxacan pottery, and this particular one is signed by a very important person in Oaxacan pottery. It's Doña Rosa, Oaxaca. You can see the signature there. Now, her daughters are still making pottery there, but in 1950, she took the traditional barro negro, which is the black clay, and she did something that people had not thought of before. The black clay had been used mainly just for utilitarian pieces because it actually was a grayish cast, as you see in the flowers here. But she figured out a technique where you used a quartz stone to polish the outside, and then you fired this part at a lower temperature, and then that way you had the contrast in the glazes. Now the part fired at the lower temperature was not as solid as the other part, and so these are primarily decorative pieces as opposed to the utilitarian clay pots that people in that area had been making for many, many decades before. Because of her invention, Oaxacan pottery became very popular and is very collectible, and these styles were repeated elsewhere in Mexico. Funnily enough, even though she was the progenitor of the style, her stuff does not always sell for as much as some of the other Oaxacan pottery. So I think it's a great thing to be buying now, because at some point the market is going to catch up to the fact that she was the trendsetter and was the one that made this happen. I think Mexican wares in general are starting to get the respect that they deserve, and they're pretty accessible in the United States because a lot of them came here or were brought back by tourists. So this little piece is 6.5 by 6.5. It's a nice little pillow vase. It's in great shape, no chips or cracks or anything. I'm starting this at only $20. I believe it is considerably more valuable than that even now. And I think this is definitely a collecting area for the future if you like this sort of look. And more people do. because it has a little bit of an ethnic flair. It's got a contrast in textures. It could be modern, it could be whimsy, it could go in a whole lot of different decor. So I think it's really great, and I think someone else is going to feel the same. Our next piece, I didn't realize that this had rather an interesting background as well, because when I look at things like this, I think, oh, die-cast cars. Well, you know, that's a new thing, and I don't generally get too excited about die-cast cars because of that, but these die-cast cars from the Brooklyn collection started being made in 1974, well before most other companies were making them, and they are still in business today well after a lot of the companies that made die-cast cars went out of business. And why is that? Well, a couple of reasons. This one is a 1980s one made in England. Originally, though, these were made in Canada. And a fellow by the name of John Hall, who was an English expat living in Canada with his family, came up with the idea in 1974 to use white metal and make very, very detailed models of cars in 1/43rd scale for collectors. Well, usually I shy away from things that are just made for collectors because kids didn't get to play with these, so gee, there must still be a lot around. But there is an exception to be made with Brooklyn because, first of all, they only made them in Canada the first 5 years or so, and then he decided to take his family back to Bath, England, and make them there. And secondly, the reason I find them really interesting is his niche in the market was to make orphan cars, cars that did not get a lot of attention from bigger makers, and that's part of why they've been able to stay in business. This is a 1948 Tucker Torpedo. It was the second design that he ever made. And this one is an English-made version, but they did make these in Canada originally. Tucker has such a fascinating history. If you haven't seen the movie and you like cars, it's a must-see. The Tucker was going to be so far ahead of its time, and Preston Tucker made 48 of these beauties. I've seen one up close in a museum. They were so incredible. They were going to be very expensive, and he kind of got rooked out of it by the other automakers. There was a lot of talk of, he ended up having to go to court and defend himself because his investors were ripped off. But actually, there was a lot of skullduggery by the major automakers who did not want him to succeed. So Tucker has an interesting history, and Brooklyn Models has an interesting history. This piece has all of its original stuff, the original box, the original liner, and the original foam. So we're going to park that right back in there. And so this is all ready to go to its new owner. Again, we're going to just start this at $9.99, but they do tend to sell for significantly more than that. And particularly if you have a Canadian model, this one is an American model. You can tell by the coating on the side. This is an English-made model. You can tell by the coating on the side, but still a good piece. And I think it will be fun to see where this gets sent. They did finally start making English cars in the 1990s. It's kind of ironic that they made mainly American cars before then, even though they were being produced in England. Next, we have a tale of two different musicians from two closely connected eras. And the first one is America's first teen idol, Ricky Nelson. By the time this folio came out in 1961, he was 21 years old, and he was being called Rick Nelson because they were trying to imply that he was all grown up. Ricky Nelson and his brother David became part of the family ensemble on their parents' radio show, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet Nelson, in 1948. And that radio show turned into a movie in 1952 called Here Come the Nelsons. The movie was popular, so that got them a TV show. And so they literally grew up on television in front of the rest of America. In the later 1950s, Ricky Nelson had a girlfriend who he wanted to impress, and he was very interested in Elvis's music and in the compositions of Carl Perkins, and so he told her, "I'm going to put out an album," and she just sort of laughed. Well, of course, he was the son of a famous TV star, and so his dad went to Verve Records and said, my son would like to cut a record. And it was perfect timing, because in 1957 there was starting to be fear and reaction on the part of parents, because they were a little bit afraid of the popularity of people like Elvis, like Fats Domino, people who didn't look like them, who shook and moved around in ways that they weren't used to. And all of a sudden, here's this very clean-cut, kind of shy, rather introspective young man. Ricky Nelson really was not actually, although he did very well and did become a star, he was not actually of a star mentality. He tended to be very to himself. Here he is with the rest of the family on the Ozzie and Harriet show. He was mild-mannered, but he looked good in a pompadour, and he could sing a little bit. So he put out his first album, and they had him do a cover version of I'm Walkin' by Fats Domino. And of course, he was safe, and he seemed like somebody it was okay to let your girl listen to and spoon over, because he was a nice, clean-cut boy. And he became a star as a musician in his own right, and pretty soon had a fortune of about $500,000 before he was even of age. He put out a whole bunch of records. He was the person who the expression teen idol was coined about. So this is your first teen idol. It's an interesting folio. He went on to do Poor Little Fool, which was number one in 1958. He actually outsold Elvis, his idol, in 1958 and 1959. So he was a big deal, and he was still touring when he died. There was an unfortunate urban legend jumped on by the media at the time that he died, that he and the members of his band were freebasing cocaine in the back of their plane, and that's why it caught fire. It turned out actually that one of the pilots was trying to evade talking about the fact that there had been all sorts of problems with the plane, that there was a gas heater line that should have been turned off and vents that should have been shut that were instead left open and turned on at the pilot's insistence right before the crash. And the pilot and co-pilot were badly burned, but they were the only ones who survived. So Ricky Nelson unfortunately died at a rather young age of 45, but this folio is here to remind us of how brightly his star burned for a while. The thing that ended his first career as a musician, before he came back with the song Garden Party, in which he ironically references John Lennon, is the popularity of these guys, the Beatles. The British invasion came along, and all of a sudden it was a new generation, and they didn't look like Rick Nelson, and they were not trying to be clean-cut, perfect middle American men. They were a bunch of interesting guys from England with crazy haircuts who sang songs. And while Ricky Nelson had set records with 30,000 people watching him in Hawaii in the early 60s, well, the Beatles were selling out Shea Stadium with 65,000 screaming fans. So the Beatles immediately became the subject of trading cards. And this lot of trading cards is our next lot to sell. There are 5 of them. They're in pretty much pristine shape. They have not got bunk corners or creases, even though I'm holding it upside down. There we go. For a long time, I believed that this was an error card, because on the front, you see George Harrison. On the back, you see the Beatles' diary, and it is the entry for John Lennon. It turned out that no, actually Topps was just pretty sloppy, and the older people who were doing this stuff had no idea who these guys were, and they just put the fronts and the backs on willy-nilly, and so there's all sorts of things that don't really match. But we have number 25. We have number 44, which is this one with them playing. We have number 40. And number 35, as well as the diary number 21A. These were a big success in 1964 and 1965 for Topps, which also made, of course, all of the baseball and football cards. So Topps was definitely glad to see these guys come along. And this little set, they typically sell for about $5 each, and we're going to put the whole thing out for $10 for the lot. and see what happens with them. But there is a lot of interest to this day in Beatle card collecting. It has never really ceased, and interest in the Beatles has never really ceased. Many wonderful things have been made in England, but the thing that the English have probably been the most well known for over the years is dinnerware. They have had a huge area in Staffordshire that was devoted to dinnerware and pottery making for centuries. And one of the companies that I have always really liked is this one. It is the Royal Winton Company, and I'm showing you the back first because then I'm going to show you the front. This originally came out in 1927, but was really the most popular after World War II, and that is because it is chintz. And English chintz is the most popular, more than the Japanese, more than the Czech chintz, more than the other countries that had Me Too lookalikes. Royal Winton chintz in particular was super popular, and especially after World War II, because during World War II, everything that made the colors, even though this is transferware, this is a pattern called Cheadle, named after a town in the Staffordshire area that I guess must have lovely flowers like this in the spring. Royal Winton Company made chintz in spades after World War II because during the war they could not get the colors to make the transferware, to do hand painting, and so after the war everybody wanted a huge splash of color. There are a number of Royal Winton patterns that are popular. Cheadle is one of the more popular ones. Summertime may be the best known. There's others that were done on a black field that are very striking and attractive. And there are a lot of chintz collectors to this day because it's so bright and so happy. Even if you just have one piece to put in the back of a display, it's just really fun and they just really pop. Now, I am only starting this at $19. The value is typically somewhere in the $30 to $35 range on these, and we'll see how much people appreciate it. But it's even more bright than the shirt I'm wearing today. So I think someone's going to like that. Now, our next two items are kind of a twofer. They're not being sold together at one price, but they both are related to the same thing, so we're going to talk about them together because they both come courtesy of Drurys Beer and Ale. And they have a wonderful Mountie and, in this case, a wonderful horse that he's standing next to as he's having his beer. The other piece that I have, and these will be two separate listings, is this one that just came to me. And in this case, forget the horse, I'm just going to ride the bottle. I think this one's great. And this is a chalkware figure that would have been in a tavern. It's in really great shape overall, actually. And on the back you see brewed and bottled by Drurys Company, USA, South Bend, Indiana, made by Plasto Manufacturing. Just love that name, Plasto. If it's Plasto, it must be great. It's interesting because it's all chalkware except the hat, which has a little bit of a chip on it, which feels like a metal disc that they put on there, probably because they thought it would chip too easily, and they wanted a nice tight-looking rim. It even says Drurys Beer on the bottle cap. This is in pretty great condition overall without any real chips or cracks or paint loss, which is hard to find. Whereas this sign is a little bit worse for wear. This is made of Sirocco wood, so it's basically a pressed composite wood product, as you can see on the side. And this one dates, as the other sign does, to about 1950. So pray tell, why is a Canadian Mountie featured on an American beer? Well, there is a story behind that. Drurys was originally founded by Mr. Drury, who paddled a canoe up the Red River from Minnesota to get to Winnipeg, where he then became one of their leading citizens, in part because he started the brewery. The brewery helped really develop the economy. This is around the 1870s when very, very few people lived in Manitoba. It had just become a province, and it did not have a major brewery. So all of a sudden he starts the brewery. He ended up being on the town council. He led a drive to plant elm trees all over the city that still exist in Winnipeg today. And the brewery was there until about 1940. Well, after Prohibition was lifted in the United States, there were still a lot of rules about not transporting beer, especially Canadian beer, which was higher alcohol content, across the border. And so they wanted to distribute in the United States, so they bought the Sterling Beer Company in Indiana, in Evansville, and they also bought a brewery in South Bend, and they changed the South Bend brewery to the Drurys Brewery. And that is why these pieces are marked Indiana, and that is why there is a Mountie on an American beer label. And the crazy thing is, a few years later, the original brewery in Winnipeg sold to what eventually became Molson Beer and was closed, and they didn't make this anymore. So suddenly you have this beer with the Canadian Mountie that is only available in the United States, primarily in the greater Chicago area and in Indiana. So that's why I'm finding these pieces around where I am, because I am not far from Evansville as I'm filming this. And so it was just really a fun story. The signs are great. I figured it has cross-border collectability regardless of where it came from. I am starting both of them at $49. I believe both of them potentially are worth about twice that, and we'll see what people think of them. But I just think they're really great, and who doesn't love a good Mountie? I mean, he cuts rather a stunning figure there with his bottle of beer. Interestingly enough, Drurys was considered a light beer for its time, and one of their claims to fame was that their beer was so pure and so light that you could actually float the can of beer in a cooler and it wouldn't sink to the bottom like the other heavier beers. Well, that brings us to our last piece for this group, and this is another really heavy piece that I have to lift with two hands because it is a Barbini vase, and it is a big, heavy, beautiful, clear glass vase by the Alfredo Barbini Company in Murano, and there it has the Murano signature on it up at the top. I'm going to hold it a little closer to me because it is very heavy. Alfredo Barbini was literally born to work in Murano. He was born in Murano, which not many people can say. He was born on the islands in 1912. He got a job as a glassmaking apprentice at the age of 13. So he started his career in 1925, believe it or not, even though Barbini is known mainly for mid-century modern glass. And he worked for he really paid his dues. He worked for all of the big companies. He worked for Sedanaise. He worked for Vitosi. He worked for Salviati, and Salviati saw so much potential in him that they actually bankrolled him in 1950 to start his own glass studio. So after 25 years of working in glass, at the age of 38, he got to start his own studio. And it is still in production today, from my understanding. This piece would have been made about 1980. This was actually given to the person I bought it from as a sales award in 1980. So we know the date. It's got these interesting buttresses. It's quite large. It's quite substantial. It's got a great mid-century look. And I know that a lot of people like color in glass right now, but one thing that's great about a big clear piece like this, and in the 1980s you would see people doing this, they would fill them with marbles and then do flower arrangements or arrangements of sticks or feathers or all sorts of interesting things. And so you can get this to be any color you want. It's a really big, thick, wonderfully made piece of glass, and these do tend to sell in the $200 to $400 range. And so I'm hopeful that this will hit that height as well. I'm starting at less than that. I think I'm starting it at $149, and we'll just see if someone appreciates it as much as I did when I saw it. But Barbini has a great background. He was connected with all the important Murano glass companies, and the nice thing is that we know that piece really is Murano, which is an issue nowadays. You do have to be careful because a lot of fake Murano labels are being put on glass from Eastern Europe and Asia now, especially the little red ones that say Murano. So do beware. Make sure you know what you're getting if you're buying Murano glass. And with that, I thank you so much for joining me. This is really fun to do, and I'm really excited to see how these items do. And I'm glad that we're able to catch up. We got a little bit behind because of family matters that I was involved with. And so I didn't get this out last month when I usually would have. So this is going to be the first of 2 that come out this month. So it's going to be a twofer. So enjoy these. Follow along the Antique Nomad on eBay. You'll be able to see what they're doing in the marketplace. You'll be able to bid if you like these pieces. And thank you so much for our level 2 and 3 members again, who get early access to this video in return for their contribution that helps make this happen so that everybody can enjoy it and get the benefit of this information and have fun with these items like I do. Thanks again, and we'll see you again very soon.
If you enjoyed this video, check out this one. Also, click thumbs up to like this video and check the description for information about our Patreon, our memberships. We've got a lot of different levels with different perks and bonus videos and early content. Also, please do check out our website, theantiquenomad.com, for appraisal help. And we'll see you again for more adventures in the antique and vintage community soon. Bye for now.